So, when FDR runs for re-election in 1936, he runs on a campaign platform entitled 4 Years Ago and Now, meaning in 1932, when the Depression was at its peak, you voted for me. What was your life like then? What were your circumstances like? And how are things now? Roosevelt's able to point to a number of inarguable improvements in terms of the United States to sort of support this idea that 4 years later the country's in a much better place. For example, 6 million more jobs have been added. The national income has doubled. Farm production is up 50%, as is factory employment and industrial output. The electrical industry is bigger than it's ever been by a quantum leap. Corporate profits have gone from $2 billion in the red to $5 billion in the black. And the net income of farmers has almost quadrupled, okay, 4 times as big. He closes out the campaign with a speech at Madison Square Garden in New York City, right back to the home stomping grounds, where it all started for him. And in that speech, he says, "The forces of organized money are unanimous in their hatred of me, and I welcome their hatred. I should like to have it said of my first administration that in it the forces of selfishness and lust for power met their match. And I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master." Well, if you look at the map right here, you can see that, Roosevelt won another landslide victory. This is the second biggest landslide in the history of American presidential politics. And this is the point where people start looking at, or historians start looking at, who it is that's voting for Roosevelt, who it is that's supporting him, right? He's winning far more votes than any candidate has ever won for either party. So what's the real background, or not background, what's the real composition, let's say, of the group that makes up the FDR voters, right? Democrats, okay, most of them, but what kind of people are we talking about here? Well, first off, the New Deal coalition, okay, as it's referred to, is a group of groups, lots of different demographic groups or constituencies, all kind of welded together under this sort of, we dig FDR, we dig the Democrat thing, at least for now, even if we didn't used to be Democrats, and we are absolutely for the New Deal. So who is it that's voting for FDR? Well, okay, Democrats in general. People that live in big cities, overwhelmingly, 104 of the 106 cities in the country, I'm not talking about towns, I'm talking about places that are large enough to be called cities. 104 out of 106 of them supported FDR in 1936, meaning the majority of voters in a given city voted Democrat, right? Union members vote for FDR, blue-collar workers, minority groups, and I don't just mean racial and ethnic minority groups, I also mean religious minority groups. Women still today tend to vote Democrat. Farmers, white people in the South, anyone on any of the New Deal relief programs, if they don't fit into one of those categories, is probably going to keep voting New Deal, keep voting FDR, because they like this assistance that they're getting, right? It's helping them. And also intellectuals. Okay, for the majority of people that had college degrees and were really well read, and those people are tending to vote New Deal, FDR, Democrat. Now, this New Deal coalition is going to stay together for the most part into and through the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. And then in the 1970s, it's going to start to fray and come apart to a degree. But even still today, in 2015 or in the next election, 2016, you can look at those groups that I just rattled off, and the majority of them are going to be voting for probably Hillary Clinton, or maybe it's going to be Bernie Sanders, but they're going to be voting Democrat. The New Deal coalition is not gone. It's just not quite the sort of juggernaut that it was once upon a time. Okay, hold on a second, guys. Not entirely sure where I'm at here. Happy day. This is the way a lecture should go, right? Okay, I know what I want to talk about now. During the Second New Deal, 1937 up into 1940, right after Roosevelt takes office, there is another kind of slate of major pieces of legislation and etc. You know, the next 100 days, a lot of things get done. The biggest things that get done right at the beginning of the second New Deal are things that your book talks about in great detail. So I'm just going to quickly go over them here, just briefly. Okay, you have the passage of the Wagner Act, or technically the National Labor Relations Act. It's called the Wagner Act, usually to make it easier to say, because it was sponsored by a Democratic senator named Wagner. And what this does is, for the first time in American history, it puts the power and the will and the authority of the federal government not on the side of the big capitalists and the factory owners and management. It puts the government on the side of the worker. For the first time, the federal government is not going to be trying to keep workers down, trying to break strikes, trying to prevent this kind of activity on the part of workers. It's going to be trying to help workers to get a fair deal, a square deal, a new deal, when they have to bargain with management, with ownership, with the big corporate powers that employ them. This law is going to create something called the National Labor Relations Board, which is a federal watchdog organization that's going to swing into action whenever a strike is going on too long, or it appears that there's no way for the two sides to move forward and get things sorted out. The federal government's going to get in there and say, okay, look, we're going to sort this out. We're going to mediate this issue, because we can't have this kind of slowdown of automobile production or steel production or whatever it might be. We can't have this, okay? We're going to sort this out. You're going to help us. We're all going to help each other. So you have the Wagner Act passed. You have FDR behind it, making this very famous quote in his speech about the law, talking about, if I went to work in a factory, the first thing I would do would be to join a union, right? You get the idea. You also have the creation of the Social Security Administration, which is created by the passage of the Social Security Act. I think you guys all know what Social Security is, right? Socking away a little bit of money for old age. Happy day. The Social Security Act was not perfectly written. It was amended later to be improved upon. It was still not perfect. It's not perfect today. You guys probably have some sense, especially if you're older folks, that the Social Security Administration is in difficulty to a large degree. You know, who knows where that's going to go. It was a great idea at the time. It's still a great idea. It's just, how exactly do you implement it and make it work? And, you know, it's not the easiest thing in the world sometimes to actually make these things happen, no matter how good-hearted or how well-intentioned the ideas are. You also had the creation of the passage of the Securities Act, which created the Securities and Exchange Commission. I'm a little out of it today, guys. I'm like brain farts big time. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which is a federal watchdog organization to make sure that the stock market is playing by the rules. There are now laws that govern the way that stocks can be advertised, can be sold, can be traded, can be moved about, can be expanded upon, can be split. All of this is going to be overseen by this federal watchdog agency. The idea being, with this reform, nothing like this will ever happen again. Well, nothing quite like it ever did happen again. We recently had a tremendous, economic upheaval, but it wasn't as a result of the same problems that occurred at the time of the Great Depression in 1929. Is the SEC perfect? No. Did they catch every bad guy? No. Have they caught a lot of them? They absolutely have. Okay. But, nothing's perfect, right? It's a constant process to try to perfect and reform and make the country work as we move 1 year and 1 decade further and further into the future. Now, Roosevelt ran into some difficulties in his second term. You guys should all know from the book and from the SlideShare about the court packing debacle, trying to add more justices to the Supreme Court. It was as a result of this that political cartoons started coming out, like the one here at the left of your screen, where you see Roosevelt portrayed as a kind of king or emperor, right? And he's got the Constitution, and he's basically canceling it. In other words, the idea being, this president believes that he's above the law, above the Constitution itself. This guy will get away with anything that he wants to. He's like an emperor. He's expanded the power of the presidency in such dramatic fashion that he's outside the boundaries of what the original authors of the Constitution of the United States really wanted? Well, again, I went into that in the slideshare. I don't agree with that interpretation, but nonetheless, there are lots of historians today who see things that way. Now, you see these two pieces of campaign advertising over here on the right, middle and right. These are for the election of 1940, okay, where you see, excuse me, this yellow button, Lincoln didn't, Washington wouldn't, Roosevelt shouldn't, what? Run for a third term. Lincoln didn't run for a third term. Washington wouldn't run for a third term, even though they asked him to. FDR should not do this, okay? And then over here in the middle, the man for the hour, Roosevelt's opponent in 1940, flanked by Washington and Lincoln, right? This is our guy. FDR can't go for a third term. Now, could he? Should he? What's going on here? Well, it wasn't against the law. There was a tradition. I discussed this when I talked about Theodore Roosevelt, right? There was a tradition that you did not go for a third term. Roosevelt did not actively seek a third term. However, the Democrats wanted him. The majority of Americans wanted him. He went for a third term, and he got a third term. He also got a fourth term, right? 1940, 1944. The graphic right there is a little tweaked. My apologies. But you get the idea here. In 40, he wins. Another, well, it's still a landslide, really. I mean, 5 million more votes, 22 to 27. It's pretty strong, okay? Pretty strong. There hasn't been a president that won that kind of victory since, good Lord, Johnson in 1964, I think. So in 1940, bam. In 1944, he wins. It's by a narrower margin, okay? Each victory from the first to the second to the third to the fourth, Roosevelt won less votes, okay? Each win was a little smaller, which means that if he'd gone for a fifth or a sixth or a seventh, somewhere in there, he almost certainly would have been defeated. It means that there's not quite so many Americans that are as thrilled with him as time goes on. I mean, as time goes on, the country's getting better. As time goes on, people want to get back to the traditions of the old America, for the most part, you know, that they loved and revered, and they were really happy with it. And that means that on some level or another, increasing numbers of people are saying, man, maybe we need a new guy. I mean, you know, nobody's supposed to be there forever. It's not like being a king or an emperor or something. Well, the bottom line is that Roosevelt did win a fourth term. He probably should not, in fact, he definitely should not have even run for a fourth term as president, because he was grievously ill at that time. His health problems were tremendous. His hypertension, his blood pressure, he was this close to a stroke. That's in fact what killed him ultimately, was a stroke. Only a few months after he began his fourth term as president. Here you see part of the FDR Memorial, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C. This great bust of Roosevelt. One of the things that I think is so impressive about Roosevelt's time as president is that it was under FDR that tremendous strides were made in terms of recognizing that the United States is not just a country full of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, that blacks matter, that Native Americans matter, every ethnic and racial group matters, and they need to be part of the mainstream of American life. That Catholics matter, that Jews matter. It's not just Protestants, okay? There's these other religious groups, and even beyond Catholics and Jews, and, you know, Muslims, Hindus, animists, what have you, okay? The United States made some real steps forward during the 1930s and 40s, and that's when we're coming up right onto the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. We made some tremendous steps forward in terms of recognizing more openly that we are a multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multicultural nation. Your book has talked a lot about this. I'm not going to go over that again. But let me tell you something that the book doesn't mention, which I think is really interesting. When Roosevelt became president of the United States, out of every 100 federal judges, okay, out of every 100 federal judges have tremendous power to interpret the law, to shape the life of the American people by determining if something should or should not be a law, by handing down decisions that articulate things in a certain way. Okay, so think about what I'm saying here. When Roosevelt became president, 4 out of every 100 federal judges were Catholic or Jewish. Only 4 out of 100. 96% of the judges were Protestants. By the time Roosevelt was done, he appointed a lot of federal judges during his time as president, okay? Not at the Supreme Court so much, just a couple there, but dozens and dozens of federal judges and circuit courts. So by the time he was done, by the time he was dead in 1945, it was no longer 96% Protestant. It was now 75% Protestant, not 4% Catholic and Jewish, but 25%. In other words, nearly every judge that Roosevelt appointed was Catholic or Jewish. And he was not Catholic, he was not Jewish, he was a Baptist. Okay, so he was a Protestant. What is Roosevelt doing here? Why is it that when he's looking at the candidates for a particular position, why is he going, let's go with this, there's 2 guys or 3 guys and they're all just as good, but I'm going to go with this Catholic guy, or I'm going to go with this Jewish guy. Why? Because Roosevelt understood that if the system of justice and the laws are interpreted always and almost exclusively through a Protestant cultural perspective, then that was going to end up creating problems further and further down the line in different ways for Catholic Americans, Jewish Americans, non-Protestant Americans, okay? You needed more voices, you needed more perspectives. Jews see things differently than Catholics sometimes. And Protestants, whatever kind of Protestant you want, sometimes they see things differently than the Catholics and the Jews. So you needed more voices, more perspectives, more cultural outlooks, let's say, blending them all together into that big old melting pot of American justice and law. This is a tremendous achievement of Roosevelt's that people don't often mention. Here are some other images from the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington. There's all these different statues in these different areas around the site. It's very cool. Like here's a guy, one guy all alone, right on some old wooden chair, sitting there listening to the first or the second or the third one of the fireside chats. There's this image of Roosevelt, or this statue of Roosevelt, in his wheelchair. His wheelchair was this really interesting contraption, something like modern wheelchairs, but very different in a lot of ways. And then I just found this picture on the internet. I thought it was great, right? I mean, see how, it's just a great image because it gives you a sense of how Roosevelt, as a handicapped, right, or a physically challenged president, could inspire a kid like this, right, who's, got his own demons to deal with. And just the look on the kid's face, just great, priceless. Here you see his image of Roosevelt with his dog, Fala. This dog was like the nation's dog the dog lived longer than FDR did, like 6 years or something. Like it was almost 20 years old when it died. The dog was almost like the nation's dog. People just sort of were very fond of it, and Fala was in the news here or there and whatever. Pictures of the president and Fala, out doing this, that, and whatnot. Here's a statue of Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady. Let me get a little water here, guys. Excuse me. When FDR became president, the mail room at the White House had one employee. Okay, there was one guy that handled all the mail that came in for the president, sorted it, this, that, whatever. And then there were a few people that were responsible for responding to letters, and then the president would sign them. But there was one guy in the mail room that handled the mail. By the time FDR had passed away in 1945, there were 50 people working in the mailroom at the White House. The one original guy, who was now the supervisor, and 49 people under him. That's how much more mail was coming in as those years went by of the New Deal and World War II. Even more than Theodore Roosevelt, FDR captured the spirit and the minds and the hearts of the majority of Americans during the most difficult period in American history. It's the Civil War on one hand, or it's the double whammy of the Depression and World War II in the other. I don't know. They both had their own challenges. They both had their own obstacles to overcome. Lincoln, FDR, it's really hard to say. But FDR was really something else. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't perfect. He cheated on his wife, you know. But he was a guy that we needed at the particularly right time. One more quick anecdote, and then we'll be done. I live in what used to be my grandparents' house. It was built in 1954, part of the big suburban housing boom after World War II. My grandparents bought it even before it was built. You know, they just saw pictures, and it's like, hey, here it is, sunny California, right near the beach, and about this house, right? The people that lived 3 doors down, Pete and Lee Stanley, they bought a house at the same time. Everybody in the neighborhood bought houses before they saw them, and so this neighborhood like came into being like all at exactly the same moment. And when I was born and grew up a little kid and got older, Pete and Lee down the street, their grandkids were like my age, so they were like some of my best friends, and Pete and Lee were like my grandparents, like my third grandparents. Like I could walk into their house any time of the day, or I just open the door and go in. I used to sleep over there all the time. I just take cookies out of the cookie jar, make a sandwich, whatever. It's like it really was like my other house, you know, on my grandparents' street. Pete was a trucker. He drove long-distance trucking up and down the West Coast, hauling lumber from Oregon and Washington down into Southern California during the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right, to build houses and things. You guys have all heard of Bigfoot, Chewbacca. You've seen Star Wars. Pete looked like Chewbacca or Bigfoot. He's like the biggest human I've ever seen. Giant, like a god or something, covered with hair. The hairiest man I've ever seen. The hairiest, strongest guy I've ever seen. When I was a kid, he was like Samson or Hercules or something like that. Pete was born in 1920 in Oklahoma. Lived on a farm. Old country boy. So when the Depression hit, he was 9. And when FDR showed up to save the day, he was 12. 12 or 13. One day, about 10 years ago, at the time that Pete was 83 or something like that, still full of energy, I went down there and I was hanging out with him. We were talking and drinking a beer. And I like to ask Pete questions about history, because he always gave me a really interesting perspective on things. He was a guy that lived through a big part of history, fought in World War II, you know, as a veteran. Like, interesting stuff talking to Pete. Really interesting. Pete was one of maybe the world's champion cusser. I've never met anybody who could cuss or use swear words in the really creative way that Pete did. Nobody was ever offended by Pete cussing, because it was just so much a part of his personality, and he was so good-natured about everything. So one day we were sitting there drinking a beer, and I said, Pete, I know that you're a Democrat, but, I've never really asked you what you thought of FDR and, his importance at the time. You were like 12, 13 when he became president. What do you think of FDR? Was he like the greatest president we ever had? Was he good, bad? What's your take on Roosevelt? And Pete leaned forward and cocked his head at me like he always did when he was going to say something that he really wanted me to get, and squinted one eye. This is the whole Pete looking at his, well, shit, David, didn't Roosevelt save the whole goddamn fucking country? And then took a drink out of the beer. Yeah, that's Pete, okay? And that's FDR. Didn't he just save the whole goddamn fucking country? Pardon my language. But if I'm going to quote Pete, I got to quote Pete. All right, there you go, guys. I'll see you next time, okay? Thanks.